about this. And then the speaker was sick too, so January didn't quite go off the way we planned. But today is going to be a lot better. It's a beautiful day, and everything is going as planned. So I first wanted to see if we have any visitors today. I don't see anybody that I don't recognize. So, so I guess it's our usual folks, and we have a few more that are joining us right now. So that's great. We're very excited today. I'm going to get my paper. That's why you don't hold those, and you're supposed to wear them. No. So we are going to have our guest speaker as the first part of our program as usual. And we have Dr. Matthew Borths from the Duke Lemur Center, Museum of Natural History. He is the paleontologist and curator of fossils there. And he is responsible for over 35,000 specimens that help connect lemurs to humans through the fossil record. His research focuses on the early evolution of mammals, especially primates and carnivores. He is part of field projects in Wyoming, Kenya, Egypt, Peru, and Madagascar. He also works with curators and researchers to make research collections more accessible to a wider audience through digitization and outreach. And his talk today is on the Trail of Fossil Primates from Wyoming to Madagascar. And I'm going to turn the meeting over to Matt for his presentation, and I'll adjust the sound once he gets.
Hi, thanks. I just want to make sure I wasn't going to talk for too long, because I do that. So can everyone see the screen right behind me? I put this up because that way I can like have an eye line for folks who are online, but I don't have to block you guys. I'll do one of these pretty often. Okay.
You can also slide the table over.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh. Static. But everyone can see with the setup. Okay, I'm not going to do that.
I can always move this, hold on, to a different channel. Okay, hopefully that's better.
Good a test.
Yeah.
Fossils. Lemurs.
That's better.
Okay. Ooh.
I'll turn it down.
Okay, everyone can hear. Okay, great. So my name is Matt Borths, and I'm a paleontologist at the Duke Lemur Center. Just a little background on me, because we're paleontologists and care where things come from. I come from Cincinnati, Ohio, and so I really appreciate seeing the Maysville fossils back here. I come from like late Ordovician bedrock, Cincinnati and Arch. And so me becoming a paleontologist isn't totally unexpected. It's just I grew up in a place where I just thought rocks were fossils. It's just miles of Ordovician block that is like every building in Cincinnati has trilobites coming out of it. And so the creeks in my backyard, it was just like, I remember there's a kid who came to visit like a friend of my parents from Florida, and he was flipping out with like going creeking in just like a local state park with all of the brachiopods and bryozoa that we could see. And I was just like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know why you're so excited about this. These are just rocks. And I was excited about them. I would collect them, but it didn't really occur to me how special that part of the world was until much later, because that's how we all relate to where we're from. Yes, we don't know how special it is until we leave. Because I did. I went to Ohio State for undergraduate, where I went in not entirely sure what I wanted to do. We got a Buckeye, yeah. And I part of the reason I went to Ohio State is because it's such a big place. There's a lot to do, and while I was there, I'd always been interested in fossils. Again, like they were like filling my garage when my parents moved to Durham 4 or 5 years ago now, getting all the rocks out of the garage and into my backyard has been the whole thing. So now I have a very weird collection of Ordovician rocks in my yard that would really confuse someone if they get buried too quickly. But at Ohio State, I took a class in historical geology because I was also working as a civil engineering assistant and was going out to job sites and like describing section and doing like footers for new buildings. and working with a geologist who had taken paleontology classes and were describing like the Pleistocene like moraines that we're cutting into. And I'm like, oh, I remember this stuff and really excited about this stuff. Apparently there are jobs where you can know these things. And so at Ohio State, I take a historical geology class taught by a paleontologist. He clearly has a job. I volunteer with him, start working on Ordovician Silurian crinoids, is some of my first papers on crinoid diversity across the Ordovician Silurian boundary. And also took an anthropology class. And while at Ohio State, met a paleontologist who was interested in the KPG boundary and mammals that cross the boundary. So went out to Bowman, North Dakota for my first kind of like vertebrate paleontology experience. There was a Triceratops horn just like laying in the Hell Creek. That was just like, well, I'm done. Except we were there to look for the little things. It's a little hard to like be dragged away. But the appeal of mammals, the idea of like the world being built in the wake of the extinction was part of what kind of motivated me as I was interested in this transition of basically like the diversification of mammals. So then I go to Stony Brook University, where I got my PhD with a researcher named Eric Seifert, who trained at Duke. And a big chunk of my research data came from the fossil collections at Duke. So I would come down and work in them. So it's not an accident that then when I get my PhD, do some postdoc work, a position becomes available at the Lemur Center fossil collection that I apply for. A lot of my research is already kind of plugged into the work that is going on in that collection. And now I've been here 7 years, almost 8, which is insane. But I'm here to tell you the story of that collection, stuff that we have at the Lemur Center, because it doesn't make intuitive sense to have a fossil collection associated with the Lemur Center. In case you are unaware of the Duke Lemur Center, it is a large collection of, right now it's about a colony of like 250 living lemurs. This is probably the most famous lemur. I didn't optimize for online. See if I'm gonna get some smooth lemur footage here. We'll just have blurry lemurs.
Could you go back to the very first picture?
Yes.
The
So,
very first
oh,
heading. There you go. Thank
to
you.
this one?
Thanks a bunch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. Mark this little thing. Pop that in there, go away. Thank you. Okay. So lemurs. These are ringtail lemurs, named because they have these beautiful ringtails. They live in the southwestern part of Madagascar, where they can live on basically anything, which is why they're so common in captivity. Then there's all these other species of lemur that are at the Lemur Center. Right now we have 16 different species of these animals. These are blue-eyed black lemurs. The males are black and the females are kind of a reddish color. We also have the cockerel shafak, which are kind of our unofficial mascot, partially because they the Lemur Center specializes in the breeding program for cockerel shafak. They're really fragile species and don't do well in captivity, but they're highly endangered. And so part of what the Lemur Center does is be really involved in conservation work. And I'll play this video at the end when I've smoothed it out so that you can see them leaping through the trees, which is the most amazing thing that they do and is what they're built for. Meanwhile, we have this fossil collection that has been part of the Lemur Center. The Lemur Center itself was founded in 1966. The fossil collection has been part of it since 1977. Why have a Lemur Center is an important question to ask. Part of the reason it exists is because lemurs as a group represent kind of what we think of as the anatomy of the common ancestor of all primates. And they are the furthest thing from us that you can be while still being a primate. And so things that we can learn about lemurs, and we know a lot about us, can help us kind of triangulate data about all of primates. And the original idea behind the Lemur Center was a lot of physiological research. Lemurs have long noses compared to us, for instance, and the way that they perceive the world through their noses is a entirely different world that we basically can't comprehend because our noses are short and our brains don't have the capacity to process as much smell data as they can. And so there's a bunch of research focused on that. There's another researcher focused on maternal-infant bonding and hormonal exchange between infant primates and mother primates. And so that data chugged along for like 10 years, but then the founders of the Lemur Center were like, we are research scientists and not zoo people. Like we don't like quite want to let our lives become subsumed by this research platform that is now being used by other researchers who can use this colony. And so they passed it off to the second director, who's a guy named Elwin Simons. And Elwin was a paleontologist. He was interested in running the Lemur Center because at that time, in the 70s, people were starting to collect a lot of data, especially from great apes, as we're trying to figure out bipedality in humans. Lucy has been found like a decade and a half ago. We're starting to appreciate that brains are not what makes us human, but feet are what makes us human. Our ability to walk around on two legs is really like the major innovation that separates us from great apes. So there's all this anatomical data being collected from great apes to try to figure out how you get a chimp or gorilla-like thing up on two legs like us. And Elwin was like, we also need data to get before that, like how do you get to an ape body? How do you get to a primate body? And so collecting data on locomotion in lemurs became kind of the point that he saw the Lemur Center helping to fill in. He was also involved in conservation ecology and wanted to diversify the colony of species. So we started bringing a lot more highly endangered species, including our eyes, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and they're bizarre creatures. The Lemur Center was the first to bring them basically from Madagascar into captivity and figure out how to keep them in captivity. So Elwin, as a paleontologist, also had a fossil collection. And he saw the fossil collection as the other way that we could connect the dots from lemurs to us, to get from something that looks like a lemur to something that looks like us. The fossil record becomes really important. And so currently we have about 35,000 specimens, and our kind of motivating like collection philosophy is basically trying to connect lemurs to humans. And what we do is follow primates on this epic journey that they've had around the world. Because primates are a really fascinating group of mammals that have managed to make it to basically every corner of the globe, except Antarctica. And actually, I don't know if there are primates in Greenland when I think about it, but like there are like European, Asian, North American, South American, African, Malagasy. Like primates have gone everywhere and figured out how to live everywhere, which means we have fossils from lots of different places to help connect these dots. And if you'd like to see some of those fossils, you are welcome to come next 2 weeks from now. On Saturday, March 28th, from 1 to 4, we have an open house. We have an open house the last Saturday of every month. So if you can't make it in March, you can try to come in April, whatever the last Saturday of April is, or May, or June, or July, going on. It gets a little weird around the holidays, like November, December. So if you're looking that far ahead, we'll get some dates up on the calendar for that because we need to figure out when those holidays fall. But you're welcome to stop by and see a lot of this material. I brought a few examples here as I go through to talk about what we do. But first, some basics that are kind of like motivating us as paleontologists looking for primates is basically like, what is a primate? So this is a primate in a tree, which is also an animal in a plant. And when we're looking for fossils, as you all know, there's key features that we're looking for. They're going to help us connect the dots between different lineages. And one of the kind of fundamental questions is basically like, what is a primate? How can we recognize one of these creatures in the fossil record? And most importantly, like, why is a primate not a squirrel? Because squirrels can do a lot of the things we think of with primates. Primates are really good at climbing in trees. They are really, and a lot of the adaptations we think of as being very primate-y seem wrapped up in that lifestyle, having kind of a big brain that helps you navigate the three-dimensional space, having grasping hands and grasping feet, having forward-facing eyes. These are all things that are key primate adaptations. They're not squirrel adaptations in a lot of ways. And so recognizing in the fossil record, like how to separate a squirrel from a primate, which has a lot of our oral adaptations, is a pretty fundamental question. And so one thing that we can do to recognize a lemur or any other primate and separate it from a squirrel is when we look at the skull of a lemur, there's this arch of bone that goes behind the eyeball of a lemur that you don't find in most groups of mammals. Basically, most groups of mammals, their eyeball is here, and then their jaw muscles are here, and there's just like a ligament that separates those two things, and there's kind of a gap between the top of the skull and the cheekbone. In primates, for reasons that we still don't really understand, there's this arch of bone that kind of gives us these goggles that go all the way around our eyeballs. You can feel your primate post-orbital bar right here, and that's been there for at least 60 million years. Another adaptation that we find in primates are these guys, having a thumb. And this is the thumb of a squirrel. The way a squirrel climbs is as grappling hooks. They basically take their claws and kind of like latch on to the tree bark. But what a lemur does is grasp. We have these wide, fat fingers that are covered in sensitive neurons that help us really perceive the world around us and give us a big grip. Squirrels don't grip. They have basically like inside their paws, and inside the end of the finger of basically all things, the last digit looks like the shape of whatever that is. So a hoof of a horse. This last bone looks like kind of a mini hoof stuck inside. Oh, great, thank you. Oh, thank you. So the bones at the end of a squirrel's claw look like a claw. And so we can recognize when we find the fingers of primates in the fossil record because we find these basically like sorry pieces, so these kind of like fat, like wide end digits. They're characteristic of primates that have these kind of the ability to grasp rather than grappling hook when we're climbing. And then specifically, then we get into like what is a lemur, how we separate a lemur from other groups of primates. One of the things that makes a lemur different from other primates is they have a tooth comb. I can pass these are 3D prints of a ring-tailed lemur skull. The tooth comb is a really weird adaptation. This is a combination of all the incisors on the lower dentition and the canine. So this big pointy tooth here is not a canine, that's a premolar that has decided it really wants to do the job of a canine because the canine has been mushed into this tooth comb that they use as a comb. Like it's kind of a completely forward, it's like perpendicular to the rest of their jaw. The root of the tooth comb kind of like comes up and then the tooth like shoots forward in a way that's really characteristic of lemurs. And the other adaptation that lemurs have is they've taken, their ancestors would have had fingernails on these like wide fingers. One of those has been like remushed into a claw. So one claw on like their index toe, essentially. It's called a grooming claw. And the grooming claw and the tooth comb are both kind of all about fur. They like use it to kind of groom themselves. And so I often wonder if the lemur could kind of like look at a monkey if they just think they're really messy because they don't have this like set of tools built into their body because they spend a lot of time keeping themselves looking so pretty. Lemurs, there are over 100 species of these things. That's actually a recent number. There for a while it was like 50 and 60. A lot of the diversity comes from these guys. They're these small bodied things like dwarf lemurs and mouse lemurs. We found a lot of kind of cryptic genetic diversity in these groups that doesn't really show up in their morphology. But there's a lot of diversity in this group, including here's the eye, which is this like nocturnal lemur that's basically like a primate trying to be a woodpecker. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The other thing that makes a lemur is it's only found in the island of Madagascar. One way to think about geography here is there are no lemurs here, and there are lemurs here. What there are in Africa are relatives of lemurs. There are things called bush babies and lorises, which are other strepsirrhines. They also have tooth combs. They also have grooming claws. And genetically, they are the closest relatives of lemurs. But it seems like that group, which isn't very diverse, is limited to Africa, whereas there's this huge diversity that happens in Madagascar. But that connection suggests lemurs got to Madagascar from Africa, and the bush babies kind of represent something like the common ancestor of all these creatures. So now to go on the quest for like, how do you get lemurs to Madagascar? Like, what is the path that primates have followed to get to that point? We enter the fossil record. And specifically, we're talking about the Cenozoic record. There's no primate or no clearly primate-y thing from before the Paleocene. There's some early Euarchnontans, so the group that includes colugos and tree shrews and primates. There's like a few bits from India from like the late Cretaceous that might be kind of common ancestor of those major groups, but nothing that's definitely a primate until we get basically like up to the border between the Paleocene and Eocene. And so when we put all of the modern diversity of primates on a family tree, lemurs are over here in the green, and we're over here in the red. And as you all, I'm sure know, like basically looking down one of these phylogenetic trees is also a temporal hypothesis. This split is older than this split, which is older than this split, which is older than this split, which means if we go back to the fossil record, we should find the common ancestor of old world monkeys in younger rocks than we find the ancestors of old world monkeys, apes, and South American monkeys. And all of those things should be younger than common ancestor of primates, which feels intuitive, but also is basically like governing what we do at the Lemur Center Museum. It's basically like, where do we think each of these branching points are? When do we think they are? And are there rocks that we can find that preserve those time periods that we can go into? And so looking at the earliest split in primates about 60 million years ago, we're looking in terrestrial rocks to find these things, because our working assumption is part of what it means to be a primate, all these adaptations of thumbs and fingernails and even forward-facing eyes with rings of bone around them are tree things. So we're not looking in marine settings for these. The earliest relatives of primates, these things called plesiadapiforms, are only found in the northern continents early in the Cenozoic. And then the earliest true primates, we call euprimates, are also a purely northern continent thing. So if you could go back to the Eocene, you wouldn't find primates in equatorial places like Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. Primates are a northern expression, which is kind of wild. It means that there are Rocky Mountain lemurs when there are no lemurs in Africa. Not real, not true lemurs. The groups that we're talking about here are adapiforms, which are, we think, on the line to strepsirrhines, and those closely related to lemurs. So these are animals that they actually don't have tooth combs yet, but might someday. And then omomyids, which are these little kind of tarsier-like creatures. They have like much shorter noses and very forward-facing eyes, seem more nocturnal, and also have longer back legs. And we think these things might be related to this group of animals here called tarsiers, which are alive today. There's a huge abundance of them, like in the islands of the Philippines. They have crazy adaptations. They are like the size of my fist, but they can jump like 35, 40 feet. And they like capture bugs in midair. They're like bats without wings, essentially. They like kind of like at night scout something that they're going to catch, as like a moth is flying by, and then like grab it in midair and then land on a tree and bite its head off. They have like needle-like little teeth, and that could be great-great-great-grandpa. So looking at North America, as you're all very aware, but I have this slide here for other audiences that don't appreciate that the colors of rocks match the time periods that we're most interested in. Out here, dinosaur country is all green for the Cretaceous, but then it's interspersed with these light grays and tans, which, as you know, are Cenozoic rocks. And Wyoming, out here near the Rocky Mountains, is a site of a lot of deposition during this early phase of mammal evolution, when dinosaurs have gone extinct and mammals are really starting to diversify. And the Rocky Mountains are a miracle. Like the fact that the Rocky Mountains happen to be popping up at the end of the age of dinosaurs and the beginning of the age of mammals means that, all thanks to this like plate that for some reason we don't entirely understand when it comes to mantle dynamics, why it was a really shallow plate. Like the fact the Rocky Mountains aren't on the west coast of North America is odd, that it's like a mid-continent mountain building event is rare. But it means that it created, because it's in the middle of the continent, there's lots of area for massive depositional basins. And so we have this incredible rich fossil record in the American West from the end of the age of dinosaurs to the beginning of the age of mammals, because of this geological accident that is a shallow subduction that led to the Rocky Mountains erupting kind of in the middle of the continent. You get basins kind of on the flanks of both sides of those mountains. And as that subduction is taking place, magma is bubbling up. The warmth of that plate going down is kind of expanding the center of the continent. That's when the inner seaway that had basically set the Laramidian continent away from the Appalachian continent drains, becomes the Mississippi River. You now have a contiguous North America caused by the kind of bubbling up of the middle of our continent. And all of that rock that gets up in the air, water says, no, I don't want that. And so it breaks it down. And you get these massive stream and river systems that flow out to the east and west from the Rocky Mountains. And that is the material that is depositing early dinosaurs, or the late dinosaurs, and early mammals. And an asteroid dust gets mixed in here at one point. And then the secondary event that happens is this slow, like low subduction that happens. This plate snaps off and like bubbles up underneath the midpoint of the continent again. And that pushes all of this rock that had been in all these depositional basins, like all the old stuff at the bottom. And we think this is like only in the last like 10 million years, really, that it bubbles up all the old stuff, erosion happens again, and cuts in, exposing basically late Cretaceous, early Paleocene, Eocene material in the American West. So we can go out and look at this stuff. Geological map of the state of Wyoming, which also just looks like a map that I've cut to size because it is a square, is basically these patches here. There's like dinosaurs and mammals all across this amazing state. But the two big sites that we have fossils from in our collection are from the Bighorn Basin, which is from the transition from the Paleocene into the Eocene, Eocene thermal maximum, which is the warmest that the Earth has been since the age of mammals began. So a lot of research goes into that, kind of looking at what happens when you warm up the Earth really suddenly. What happens to the biological systems we have all over the world. Then the Bridger Basin is Middle Eocene, so it's kind of like in the wake of the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. You pick up the story down here and look at what the diversity of these early mammal faunas look like once things have settled down from the thermal maximum. So here's a shot of 55 million years ago where you have this adipiform primate Cantius, who's right here. I can pass him around. This is a palette of Cantius. And I should point out that this is Trish Fuller's handwriting. That I'll have into this. So what you're looking at, like the Bighorn Basin fossils are terrible. They have been tumbled by these massive stream systems that were depositing them. And so this is this part of the skull, and actually one of the more complete pieces of the skull of Cantius that we have in our collection. Eyeballs would have been here. Its snoot is going this way, and so you're looking at kind of like the roof of its mouth as you're passing this around. And part of how we can tell we're looking at a primate dentally is it's like very low, kind of basically fruit gnashing teeth. It's like what primates do is we climb and we eat fruit. And that's exactly what Cantius is doing right there. And meanwhile, other creatures are hopping around, things like this early Perissodactyl, early Artiodactyls, early carnivores. You know, it's this world of a lot of small creatures. Nothing is much bigger than a sheep, but it is a ecosystem on the rise as we go into the Bridger. So from Cantius is as close as we can get to an ancestor in the fossil record for creatures that come from the Bridger that are things like Netharctus and Smilodectes. And so this is the skull of Netharctus, which is a 3D print of a skull that we have at the museum. And this is if you come to the open house, you can see this is a skeleton, it's the most complete skeleton of Netharctus that's ever discovered that was found in 2016 on the Bridger Basin. And then this skeleton is at the Smithsonian, but we have a skeleton that we're mounting Smilodectes like that. Smilodectes, you can see, is like a shorter face compared to Netharctus. I think of Smilodectes as being kind of shafak-like, these like bounding, long-legged, kind of springy lemurs, compared to Netharctus, which looks a little bit more like a ringtail lemur. They have longer noses. And they're all living in the same environments in ancient Wyoming. Just kind of show you what that looks like. Oh shit, this is going to be a little choppy again, isn't it? Smooth this out. Let's just stop sharing for a second. And we'll reshare, optimizing for video. Well, what kind of stop motion? Well, that's fine. So this is the Bighorn Basin. There we go. Here's my colleague Paul Morse, who's hiking out here. He's a primate paleontologist. And you can see kind of the colored banding. These are basically like as these massive river systems that are coming off of the Laramidite orogeny are all starting to like wind across the landscape. You get different deposition iron concentrations. these are the Uinta Mountains in the background, where like that is the source rock of the stuff that I'm sitting on that has like filled this basin that's been uplifted. And when you get like on the surface of it, it is just mud. Like this stuff erodes really, really quickly. And on the surface, it's like this kind of popcorn that it pulses, and fossils will actually just kind of like be sitting on the surface. But if you touch them and you're not careful, they can like fall down the cracks into this popcorn. This is a large kind of like gopher-sized rodent from the Bridger. This is one of my colleagues, Doug Boyer, who is one of the kind of preeminent like primate origin researchers, who's based at Duke, and then his grad student, Maddie. And this is a collaborator, Alex, from the Burke Museum, who is kind of like the fossil primate whisperer who we work with in the Bridger. And he found this Smilodectes skull that was still in situ, so it's like in like hard rock. And we found an ankle bone like popping out of the rock over here. And so you can see that it's like this kind of flat, like we're like on the bedding plane. It's like a resistant bedding plane. And so most of the fossil hunting we do is like just picking stuff up off the ground. It looks like kind of we like dropped our keys in the desert. But this is requires some quarrying. And so we get very sophisticated equipment like hammers and chisels to like get into this stuff. And this was really frustrating because again, it was like on the flat bedding plane. So trying to create a trench to then go around and get this stuff out, which dinosaur people are very comfortable with, but is less familiar to me. And this block has been keeping the specimen safe for 50 million years. We don't use rock saws to do this because the specimens we're working on are so small that if you like get through a fossil, you like lose the width of the blade, and that's like the ear region of a primate. So everything has to be done by hand so we can get clean breaks, and we collect all the flakes. And this is like going back to my office when I'm giving this virtually, and I'm not because I'm here in person. It's very exciting. And so this is some of the fossil team that went out last year. So grad student from Duke, folks in the Lemur Center, Catherine Riddle, who is the collections manager at the Lemur Center, and Carrie Whitman, who is our fossil preparator. And we continue to find tons of stuff. So this is the snout of an animal called Paleocytops. It's this tapir-like animal that has these huge nasal-like projections that probably gave it a little bit of trunk. It's an early Brontothere, which are these like kind of ancestor relatives of like rhinos and horses. And part of what I'm also showing here is like it's in this popcorn. This setting is like high altitude. We're like higher than Salt Lake, which is higher than Denver. So it's currently blanketed in snow and will be, and then it all melts, and then it snows again, and melts and snows again. And so part of the reason we go out to these sites over and over again is because the erosion is so fast that you can lose like this entire skull in a single season because you're kind of pulsing the surface and spring rains come through and wash it all away. So that's part of the reason why the Bridger is such a productive fossil locality is it's not baking, it is a like dynamic erosional setting. So there's all these primates out west, but being in the North Carolina Fossil Club, there are primates here. They are just very few and far between. This was an animal described in 2001. It's a little omomyid that was found in the Chesapeake Bay. Basically, there was a amateur paleontologist who was panning for shark teeth, essentially, and was paying attention to the microfossils that were in his catchment, and found this little chunk of teeth and took it to a researcher at Johns Hopkins University in Kenny Rhodes, and because he thought it looked a lot like primate, and it was. So it was this little omomyid that this fossil would have been tumbled out with the kind of outwash from East Coast, like Eocene rocks. And so there's Eocene here in North Carolina. Most of it's marine, but there is the potential of terrestrial stuff getting mixed into that.
Could you pull that slide down just a little so we could read?
Yeah, actually, is it this one? There we go.
Oh, perfect. Think about it.
So yeah, that is something to look for the small stuff. And again, the sort of what an omomyid is these little kind of it's us, like our kind of distant relatives. And there's not a ton of it, but we know from kind of reconstructions, like North Carolina would have been above ground at this point, and probably would have been a place that a lot of these early primates were also living, which is not as favorable a depositional area as we have out in the American West. So we have all these primates in the north during the Eocene, but then we need to get them into Africa. And the reason it's important that we get them into Africa is because then they go extinct in the north. And so Africa becomes kind of a refuge for these creatures. One of the things to note here is that Africa is an island continent at this time. There's no connection between Africa and Eurasia. The closest that you get is kind of along the northern coast. And even then, it's pretty far away. And so part of what has happened over the last like tens of millions of years is Africa is sliding north, which is why there's a whole bunch of oil that gets preserved in this part of the world because the Arabian Peninsula is part of Africa that swings out and kind of connects with this part of Eurasia, and all of that compresses all these marine rocks and organisms, and that creates big oil wells. Which is the same reason why we have a bunch of oil over here is because South America is doing the same thing as it's sliding north into North America. But at this time, it's far enough away that you can't walk from Eurasia into Africa. And the working hypothesis for how primates did that is by island rafting. So I should say originally the hope was when plate tectonics was described as a phenomenon, it's like, oh, we can explain the distribution of primates by putting Pangea back together again, because if the common ancestor of primates was like in Africa plus Madagascar plus South America, then we can just have the diversity of primates happen as like common ancestors here, continents drift apart, and then they separate and you get lemurs as like a group of primates that specialize in Madagascar life. You get Old World monkeys specializing in African life, and you get New World monkeys specializing in South American life. Problem is, the separation between South America and Africa, and the separation between Madagascar and Africa, is like predates the arrival of like placental mammals. So like we're not dealing with a time that like the time doesn't line up with when primates would have been around. So instead, we have to get them across oceans. So the working hypothesis is primates love to live in kind of coastal forests, and a lot of coastal forests are mangroves or plants that have adapted to live a lot like mangroves. And mangroves are basically plants that figured out like I don't need soil anymore because I can get lots of sunlight if I kind of rush out into the water column. I'll just wrap my roots around my friends and then also get nutrients from like whatever is kind of like silty around my roots. And it's a great strategy because there's tons of sunlight out there in the river mouths and coastal margins that other plants can't live in. Problem is when there's a big storm surge, it comes up underneath these plants that don't have any anchor to the land, and big chunks of mangroves get snapped off during a storm surge. And then when the storm surge goes back out, the negative pressure of that just sucks it out to sea and gives kind of an engine to these chunks of forest that go out in the ocean. And if there's a primate that happens to be sheltering in that, it gets blasted out to sea too. And this is a phenomenon that's been observed in modern ecosystems. If you have very expensive shipping barges and a big hurricane or cyclone happens, you're very aware of all this stuff that gets washed out from the coast, and you're very aware of like some of these are like half-mile wide, like plant bergs almost, that are off the coast of South America, off the coast of Africa. And so our idea is given enough time, given millions of years, eventually enough primates will make it across that you can have a founding population that gets blasted from the northern continents into Africa. And what we know is like the monkey line and the lemur line have already split in the northern continents. So there must have been two different colonization events of Africa to get a lemur and a monkey thing down into Africa. And we're really lucky that that happened because at 35 million years ago, during the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, primates go extinct in the northern continents. One of the reasons we think that happens is Antarctica has finally broken off from Australia and South America. Warm water that used to come down and kind of bounce off of this combo continent and would like be warm, get cold, but then it would come back up and get warm again and then keep cycling. And so the whole kind of ocean current temperature stayed like pretty warm-ish, even into the high and low latitudes, or even to the high latitudes. That system gets broken when Antarctica becomes an island continent. Cold water comes down and just stays down, goes around Antarctica over and over, and we get air conditioning unit on the bottom of the planet. That causes terrestrial ice to form in Antarctica, which triggers terrestrial ice in the north, and the northern latitudes start to get drier and cooler. And that is not good habitat for primates. So we're really lucky that this ocean voyage happens for our ancestors. Otherwise, primates would have gone entirely extinct in the Eocene boundary. So we can pick up the story then in Africa at the site called the Fayum Depression in Egypt. So it's in northern Africa. Africa does not have Rocky Mountains. It does not have a convenient kind of uplift at some point that created a nice kind of depositional environment with these like layers and layers of rocks. Instead, the best window we have into the like early age of mammals from Africa is all coastal stuff. So basically, as sea levels rising and falling, we're getting what looks actually a lot like kind of the North Carolina coast. Like it's a similar kind of sequence of Cretaceous and Paleocene and Eocene, but there's a lot of erosion taking place on the surface. It's not a complete record. But fortunately, we get this one window that at the Fayum is probably most famous for being the site of Wadi Katan, which is the Valley of the Whales, which is this UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's like 4 or 5 basilosaur skeletons that are just like laid out on the floor of the Sahara Desert. So that's in the marine sequence. And then there's terrestrial sequences that come over top of that. And that's what we have here. It's basically like as the coastline marched forward, there's this kind of mangrove swamp-like environment that is where primate likes to live. And so today, it is very much not a mangrove swamp environment. It is just the Sahara Desert. It is dry, sandy stuff. But this is like the floor of what was a shallow sea. And this site that we're working on is basically like point bar that would have gone out that caught a whole bunch of terrestrial stuff before it like kind of washed out with wave action. It's also, the Fayum is really important as an archaeological site. So it was basically an Egyptian like resort town. It was connected to the Nile. And it partially became a desert because the Ptolemies, the Greek-speaking rulers of Egypt, decided it was so nice that they would like to have a lot of farms in the area instead of shipping in as well, like the population was growing. And so they took this oasis that was like a large lake, it's kind of like Falls Lake size, and decided to use it, try to irrigate the desert so they could just grow everything there and they wouldn't have to leave their resort town. And the lake shrank by like down to like a fifth the size it was. And so early experiments in terrestrial engineering has been a problem for humans for a while. So this used to be like surrounded by a garden, we know from the archaeological record, and it's not there anymore because the water went away. And the water has also gone away because there used to be a whole lot more. This is what a terrestrial landscape would have looked like in the Fayum about like 34 million years ago. And so down here we have a Sirenian and Arsenothere, which is basically a relative of elephants and other proboscideans that really wants to be a rhinoceros. Giant hydaxes, more on them later. Big crocodiles, heron-like birds, and then primates that are up in the trees. Eating, this one has this little fruit that's right here, so that's what this is. It's a fruit called the epiprenum, and its relatives still are eaten by primates, especially in Southeast Asia. Some cats will eat that. They're kind of like custardy. They remind me a little bit of pawpaw, as far as the kind of texture of the like kernels that they have. So primates love them. And the other piece of what's going on in the Fayum is all these Afrotherian creatures are diversifying. So, as you may know, Sirenians and elephants and hyraxes and aardvarks are all part of this like native African group of mammals that seem to have evolved like in the island continent of Africa. And may have also involved hyenodonts, which are these kind of carnivorous creatures that are living in the ecosystem. And so primates are these interlopers from the northern continents that defined a way to live in this like native African habitat. And they did so successfully alongside rodents and maybe even marsupials that are other kind of rafting creatures that arrive. In the Fayum and in Africa, as we get the transition from homomiid, like early monkey-like relatives to true monkeys. It's where we get anthropoid primates. And so this is the skull. This is a cast of the skull of an animal called Egyptopithecus, which means the Egyptian ape or the Egyptian monkey. Pithecus can kind of like rotate around the analogy there, or the meaning. And one of the things that makes a monkey or an ape different from a lemur is lemurs and monkeys and apes all have postorbital bars. So we have like a ring of bone here. But then we take it to the next step and we have true eye sockets. So you can see on this cast that there's actually bone that goes behind the eyeball. So if you imagine like a Halloween decoration skull, like you can't see like through the eyeball in the same way that you can with a lemur. This is an eye skull. So I put my finger through the ring of bone. You can't do that with like a human skull. We have an eye socket or bony orbit has been closed in. And so these are some of the first eye sockets in the fossil record. Just how we know we're dealing with monkeys. We also have lemurs, because we have to get the lemurs from the northern continents to Africa, and then from Africa we have to get them down to Madagascar. And so this was a discovery from 2019, so it's a relatively recent one, that eyes as a group, which are these really strange kind of nocturnal lemurs, have a fossil record that goes to the Miocene of Kenya and then to the Fayum. We have the earliest kind of thing that has eye-like teeth in the fossil record at the Lemur Center, which is especially exciting because the Lemur Center was the first place that lemurs lived outside of Madagascar. And so then in our collection at the Lemur Center Museum, we have the oldest fossil of an eye. And the reason for that is we have all these international collaborations through the museum with Egypt, with Colombia, with Madagascar. And the deal is the fossils that we collect, half of them stay in country and half of them come to Duke. And it should be a redundant collection. So we find 2 hyrax jaws. One hyrax jaw stays in Cairo, one comes to Duke. And the idea is like fire and flood and administration silliness can cause all kinds of stuff to happen in these collections. And so like not putting all your eggs in one basket, essentially. So this was originally cataloged as a rodent because it has this really long kind of ever-growing front tooth. And so there's only like one jaw underneath this. So it's in our collection, which is really exciting. And this is kind of reconstruction of what these things would have looked like. So we're going from an eye thing. Propado is this Kenyan Miocene animal, and Plesiopithecus is the Egyptian one that would have looked kind of, more like a primitive lemur. And the reason this becomes important is going back to that like divergence that we talked about. How do we target where and when we expect to find things? We know lemurs live in Madagascar today. Madagascar has a terrible fossil record. We don't have a fossil record between the end of the age of dinosaurs and basically 12,000 years ago. It just doesn't have the depositional basins and uplift that let us see what's going on the whole continent of Madagascar for like 66 million years. But we do have Africa, and Africa can give us a little bit of help when it comes to when we think things went from Africa to Madagascar. And so if we have like a proto-eye looking thing in Kenya 20 million years ago, that suggests that eyes don't get to Madagascar until some point after 20 million years ago. So it helps to like zero in on what rocks are we looking at in Africa that might preserve some of the earliest lemurs, the things that might have like true tooth cones that are going to be the ancestors of what lives in Madagascar today. And that is where this new project fits in. Tobernawi is a site in Kenya that's 29 million years old. This is like the day after the Fayum. The Fayum, the youngest rocks from the Fayum are 29 million years old. These rocks that are 29 million are like closer to the equator. They're basically closer to Madagascar. This site was discovered in West Turkana. So Lake Turkana is on the border of Ethiopia and Kenya. And it's most famous for its Pliopleistocene rocks. This is where carnivores comes from, one of the most complete Homo erectus specimens that's ever been found. There's all kinds of amazing kind of Australopithecus-like things that come from these rocks. And then there's Tobernawi is this one little bubble of really, really old rock in the midst of all this really young rock. And it's not entirely clear tectonically like why there's this one kind of like chunk that happens to be older that's exposed to the surface. It was only identified as fossiliferous in 2016, and when it was identified 10 years ago, it was initially thought to be Miocene. So Miocene is like the oldest yet in Turkana. But then there were interpreted as Miocene. But in 2019, the salts from Tobernawi were dated, and it came back as early Oligocene. So it rewinds the clock to basically like the early diversification of lemurs and monkeys, and possibly the origins of apes. And so a lot of attention now gets focused on this site. And this is Kate Neely, who's our digital collections manager. And it was Kate's first experience looking for fossils. Originally, Kate was going to go with me to Wyoming last summer. And that's also when I was going to give a presentation to the North Carolina Fossil Club. But then we got the call that there was money and time. I had been signed up. I have 2 young children. I was planning on going to Kenya. But other taxon experts ducked out of the project, and I needed to go and identify the stuff that we were finding. And so Kate came along as a research assistant to help digitize this stuff. And it is a wildly frustrating place to work because there are not very many fossils. Like, there's a reason that this wasn't identified until 2016. There are these big chunks of wood in these like huge, this is basically like pure ash. So this is kind of a ash flow from, there were these massive, basically as the East African Rift is starting to open up. The reason why East Africa has so much human stuff is because the Rocky Mountains are happening in Africa right now. Like, East African Rift is cracking open the whole continent of Africa. And that's been happening since like about 29 million years ago. So these are like the first ashes as Africa is starting to kind of fracture. And these massive kind of flood deposits that are mixed with ash are not very kind to fossils. So most of the fossils that we find are just like isolated teeth, like individual molars of animals that are, this is like filled in with sediment. So it's like really hard to recognize these things. And the whole thing is cut with these massive dikes that are basically, as like the surface is cracking open, getting filled in with all these, basically the plumbing of volcanoes.
Was that circle on the last slide showing of the time?
Yeah, so yeah, when they find a fossil, they basically spread like all the rocks off, because it's basically, you find these just kind of like in among all these pebbles. And so then you have the fossil, and then you like slowly work from that point, kind of like clearing rocks away to see if there's more fossils in the area. And then we take a photo and a GPS coordinate for that fossil. And we only find like maybe a dozen specimens a day, working with a team of like 20 people. And most of the fossils we find are from giant hyraxes. Hyraxes are these little kind of grumpy rabbit-looking things that today are mostly in Africa. There's some in like Southwest Asia. And they were the only game in town when it came to like large-bodied, like not large-bodied, like mid-sized herbivores in Africa. Like you have elephants at one end of the scale. Then hyraxes were the antelope and the rhinos and the zebras of ancient Africa before zebras come in from North America, before giraffes come in from Asia. Like a lot of the African ecosystem today is actually kind of like have invaded since the Arabian Peninsula connected Eurasia to Africa. Before that, this Afrotherian world has giant hyraxes. This animal, the biggest titanohyrax, would have been kind of like a small cow-sized animal. And we find tons of them. Like most of the fossils that come from Tobernawi are all like giant hyraxes, and normal-sized hyraxes too. And these are a lot of genera that we have at the Lemur Center. So they come from the FIU. It's part of the reason I involved this project, is identifying these creatures. But we do find primates. And so this is an animal that's unpublished right now, but it is a sten ape that isn't that different from Egyptopithecus, but it's different enough that it's like more on the ape line. And what you're looking at is like these are reflected teeth. We just have like 6 teeth of this thing so far, and they're all isolated. You kind of see how Tobernawi plugs in, like there's the Fayum, then Tobernawi, and then we get a more continuous sequence as we go younger. And the thing we're really hoping for is that in among the ape fossils, we'll also find lemurs. We have some incisors that look like tooth comb incisors. We're doing kind of process elimination for looking at rodents and other creatures, just to like make sure what we're looking at is what we're looking at. But it looks like we're finding some of the first like tooth comb bearing primates that may connect Tobernawi, ultimately the origins of lemurs, because, like I said, around 20 million years ago is when we think lemurs get from Africa to Madagascar and colonize this island. And they're not the only thing that colonizes the island. There's other African creatures that make it from Africa to Madagascar. So this is a group of animals called tenrecs. Tenrecs, they're like lemurs in Madagascar. There's like dozens of species of these things on the island. There's one African tenrec called the greater otter shrew. Greater otter shrew is one of the only mammals that swims by moving its body left to right instead of up and down, which is kind of fun. It has like this big kind of like almost eel-like tail. It looks really strange when it swims. But so it's a little bit like bush babies, but there's like bush babies in Africa and then lemurs in Madagascar. Huge diversity in Madagascar, very limited diversity of bush babies in Africa. Huge diversity of tenrecs in Madagascar, very limited diversity in Africa, which is kind of odd because tenrecs are small, kind of hedgehog-like creatures, that there's no reason that they should be so limited in their diversity. One reason might be rodents have come in and really diversified in Africa, but tenrecs evolved alongside African rodents, and then there's rodents that make it from Africa to Madagascar. This is a like native Malagasy group of rodents. And then there's also carnivores that get over. This is kind of the only example of carnivores crossing from one continent to another. There's this animal called a fossa, which is like the main mammal predator of lemurs. They have hind foot reversal. They can like make their foot go backwards, so they can go head first down a tree, and can like go at a dead sprint after a lemur. They're like better in the trees than the lemurs are. And they are terrifying to watch hunt, which is what people only see like 3 times because it happens so quickly. You mostly just find chewed up radio collars of the animals you're trying to study. And so then our collection shifts the theater to Madagascar. So these dots all are places across the island where we have fossils from Madagascar. The problem is that they're not very old. Like I said, Madagascar doesn't have a fossil record, terrestrial fossil record, from before about 12,000 years ago. So you have the end of the age of dinosaurs. There's an amazing dinosaur diversity from Madagascar. And then nothing until about 12,000 years ago. And so arguably these aren't fossils. Like most of what we have from this time period are younger than 10,000 years old, which technically isn't a fossil. But what we have is evidence that Madagascar was a wildly biodiverse place today, and was even more so in the very recent past. Particularly among the lemurs, there were giant lemurs that lived on the island. So this is the skull of Megalopithecus edwardsi. And so it is a gorilla-sized lemur. The way we know it's a lemur is because right here, we've got a ring of bone all the way around its eyeball. So you can see that we're dealing with a primate, even though it has a very almost cow-like face. And here you can't see like the incisors have all fallen out. So we don't see evidence of the tooth cone, but I can pass this skull around. That's a cast. But then here I brought a jaw of the smaller species of Megalopithecus madagascarensis, and it does have a true tooth cone. So again, like we're dealing with a lemur. This one I'll keep up here so you can look at that after I'm done talking. Hopefully we'll be soon. Today, the largest lemur that lives in Madagascar is an indri, which is kind of like a handful of lemur. So these other creatures are all much larger than what we have today. So the giant lemurs, as far as we can tell, they've only gone extinct in the last 1,000 years. So it's a very, very recent extinction. Like there are like, you know, people building, like getting ready to build castles. Like castles are being built in France when this whole diversity of lemurs is still like perfectly healthy in Madagascar. And these animals aren't completely extinct as far as we can tell until maybe 300 years ago. So like while people are like getting ideas about independence in North America, there might have been Megalopithecus still walking around in Madagascar. So here's what the whole skeleton of Megalopithecus looks like. It's a really weird animal. It's got really like stumpy back legs and really long forelegs. So sometimes it's called a koala lemur because it has this kind of like, I think it looks more like a gorilla, honestly. I think koala lemur makes it sound small in a way that they're not koala-sized lemurs. They just have these like weird proportions. There's also sloth lemurs, which do earn their name very honestly. They have kind of hook-like hands and teeth that are built for chewing leaves. This is an animal about the size of a golden retriever. And then there's elephant birds, the largest bird that ever walked the planet. It's kind of like tied in height with the moa from New Zealand. But it has like, it's just a chunky animal. It's got really thick bones. So it would have been like the heaviest bird. Its egg was the largest bird egg that was ever laid. And bird eggs are big for their body size. Basically, like ostrich eggs are like the biggest like extant dinosaur eggs. Like there's no, like T-Rex's egg wasn't bigger than an ostrich egg. And so elephant birds laid the biggest dinosaur eggs and the biggest bird eggs. And also a mother elephant bird making an egg cell in her body was making the biggest cell any vertebrate has ever made because it's just a big egg. In the trees is the cave fossa. This would have been like a mountain lion-sized creature. And there we have a new species of cave fossa that's coming out, I hope. It's a thing we've been working on it for forever. We got comments back, but there's the modern fossa, which is like the size of, it's like from nose to the the base of its tail is about this big, and its tail is like twice its body length. So they've got these huge like balancing rods of tails. The cave fossa would have been kind of like nose to base of its tails here. And we found a humerus that is like outside any of the size range of any cave fossa that's ever been found. And so it's even a bigger cave fossa that would have been like nose here and like base of its tails here. So like an elephant bird hunting fossa. So stay tuned for that to eventually emerge from Journal of Paleontology, Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology. The thing to remember in all this is these aren't ancestors of lemurs. Like these are lemurs that are like living alongside modern species. Like we find this is the skull of a shafak. So it's one of these guys. It's just like this is just a cockerel shafak skull that we find in the same site that we found Megaladapus. Like we just have the same species is around at the same time. So we are when we're talking about these creatures, we're talking about in Madagascar that basically like modern species are missing this really important part of the ecosystem. So we try to figure out how to conserve these animals. We need to understand that whatever role they have in their ecosystem, they're living in this kind of almost like post-apocalyptic, like Walking Dead world, where like the world is different than it's ever been before because it's missing this huge component of its ecosystem. And so we're looking at animals that are like in the process of adaptation to a whole new way of being. Which pictures like this are a little deceptive because this is all like the extinct lemurs. So we have Megaladapus in the trees. We have monkey lemurs down here, which are lemurs that have short faces, big brains, small hippos that are like swimming through the water, but we don't have like modern species in this picture. It kind of creates this idea this is like an ancient Madagascar world. There should be pictures of like dwarf lemurs and tenrecs just kind of walking through the scene because that's what it would look like. And the natural question becomes like, why did these things go extinct? People are a big part of it. People arrive in Madagascar. The language of Malagasy actually comes, its closest relative is Sumatran. The peopling of Madagascar looks like it was part of kind of the peopling of like Australasian people spreading across the Pacific and Indian basins. And so they come to Madagascar from the east instead of from the west because the wind patterns are really, really unfavorable. Basically, everything that blows that way on the Mozambique Channel. And so you can't get from mainland Africa to Madagascar without the ability to tack. And that kind of sailing technology was invented by these guys. And then doesn't kind of get like co-invented up here until much later. And these folks bring with them rats, and cats, and dogs, and pigs, and they bring rice. And rice is a domestic product that needs a whole lot of water and a whole lot of nutrients. So we think that the expansion of agriculture in Madagascar is largely what's responsible for the extinction of a lot of these large animals, which is a very modern way to go extinct. There's some evidence of butchery of large lemurs. There's elephant birds with like cut mark bone, but not nearly as much as you find in archaeological sites where people are subsisting on large animals. These are people who brought with them domesticated animals. So they're subsisting on chickens and cows and goats. Like the wild animals are not what they're going for. So it's this much more passive way of going extinct, which is how we think mountain lions went extinct in North Carolina, bison went extinct in North Carolina. Like it's basically the expansion of agriculture that pushes these things out.
Can you explain that picture?
Yes, so this is going into a cave, which is where most of these fossils are preserved. So this is a cave site where we're kind of crawling down this big entrance. You can see there's this big tree at the top with these huge like roots. That is basically the tree finds this huge aquifer that runs along the whole like west and southern coast of Madagascar. The tap roots can get all the way down into the limestone, and then once the tree finds water, we're in a very dry part of Madagascar here. The growing plant cracks open the limestone and creates the cave. And so there's a relationship between us finding these caves and these plants. And because they have access to water basically year-round, you can search for these sites by going on Google Earth and rewinding in dry season. And you find these like green polka dots across the landscape where these trees are able to get water year-round. And so we can like put those GPS coordinates in and then like go and see if the tree has made a cave. And in this case, it did. It was a very, very deep cave, so there wasn't a ton of fossil material in there. This was a smaller one that is a classic kind of skylight cave. So this is me rappelling into the cave. And again, you can see these huge roots that kind of crack the surface. And here, it's basically like a sewer drain for the forest. And so the bottom is just layers and layers and layers of stuff that's been washed into this cave over the last couple of centuries. And so Carrie is at the top, and that's my safety. She speaks Malagasy, so it's a very useful person to have as your safety at the top of the cave in Madagascar. And so we rigged up like a rescue ladder to get into this situation. And in the caves, you find things like this tiny mouse lemur skull. It's basically, like I said, like a modern mouse lemur. But we can potentially get genomic material out of this. People have been able to get the gene sequences of Megalopithecus out of some of its bones and teeth. The reason we're looking at caves for all of this, the way that caves work, as you probably know, are limestones that are basically calcium carbonate platforms that then become dried out and they get uplifted. Basically, like all these limestones were uplifted when Madagascar drifted away from Africa during the Jurassic. Then groundwater, which is slightly acidic compared to the slightly basic calcium carbonates, moving through dissolves these tubes that go through the rock. And eventually you get erosion from the surface that meets one of these tubes, and then you get a cave. And they become these settings for like lots of things to accumulate inside of them. Some of them still have water flowing through them. And so the project that I've been focused on for the last couple of years is down in the southwest in Simcoe-Suits National Park, which is the spiny thicket, which is spiny and very thickety. It's a very hard place to go for a hike. It has these beautiful baobabs that are kind of growing through the landscape that are centuries old. You can see next to it, all that white is just spikes on that U form, which is basically a cactus wannabe that is in Africa and Madagascar. And here's another one of these skylight caves where here's our tree that has like cracked the surface of the cave, and there's this like big spoil pile where stuff is kind of eroded down the sides, and a rappel line going into these. So we basically went on this like reconnaissance mission. Like, look, we can find all these like polka dots, and we're going in and checking all the polka dots. And in this cave, we found a horned crocodile, which is a relative of the Nile crocodile, alongside these mouse lemur bones and rough lemur bones. These are some of my Malagasy colleagues I work with. But like I said, some of these caves are so flooded. And so this is a cave diving paleoanthropologist named Zach Kluper, who has become certified in cave diving in order to become part of this project. And he, in this particular cave site, dives down, or in this one, one of his colleagues, another cave diver, is going into basically a well that I rigged up. And funnily, I have some scuba experience, but I've sworn to my family that I will not combine caving and scuba. But I can't combine caving and ropes, and so I was able to rig the ropes here, which the cave diver was unfamiliar with rappelling. So I was like, oh, I have something that I can add to this team. And it was really lucky that we rigged this up because he was able to go down and came up with another one of these horned crocodiles. He also came up with a juvenile sloth lemur. And again, what's cool about these sites that are underwater is we can get a lot of biopaleo, like basically in the sediments. We can collect the sediment at the same time. And we have a team that's going through like seeing if they can find some genetic matches within this stuff. So here's one of these horned crocodiles, just the horns on its head. That these guys arrived in Madagascar about 20 million years ago. And like I said, they separate from the group that has around crocodiles, but are part of probably the colonization of Madagascar along with the rodents and the fusas and the lemurs. And so these are just gorgeous photos of these guys. Cave diving that I did not take. You can see up here is where the skylight is. So we are kind of like perched on the side here is where we're looking at fossils. And then they drop down in this chasm to explore the surface of this. And so here is this sinkhole where, again, the tree is what's responsible for making this cave site. And there's still fossils, well, there's still bones accumulating here. So the lemurs will still like come down these roots to come down and get a drink. And occasionally they'll fall in. And so there's like carcasses of like modern animals like on the surface of these things. So you go below that and find these extinct animals. I thought that was a video. So here's Zach coming up with a box of fossils that we then dry out very slowly. Like this. So this is a giant rough lemur, which is the rough lemurs are the ones that look like they have beards. And so this is like a size and a half bigger than that. And it seems like there's this huge colony of rough lemurs that just like ran this little patch of water for centuries. Because that's mostly the bones that we find, but there's also bits of, this is the sternum of a really large kind of a cuckoo relative that lives in Madagascar today. And so it's this mix of like extinct stuff and modern stuff. So again, getting at the genetic relationship between these things, like when and where do we have the extinctions taking place across the island. Megalopus femur that comes out of this in a dry cave. And it's been an amazing project and continues to be. And trying to figure out how to get back there is my current grant writing project. So with that, so we got from Wyoming to Madagascar. I'd like to thank you all for your patience and your attention, and many of the funding sources that have made this possible. All the folks who actually go out and collect fossils to make all of this research possible. If you're interested in the Lemur Center, we have a podcast called iPod that you're welcome to listen to. And like I said, we have an open house in 2 weeks that I'd love for you to attend. So thank you very much. Just starting to move on. Yeah.
So in Oregon, and we see John Day fossil beds, Eocene, Miocene, they're primate-like things. Does that lead to anything, or did they die out?
They are, so what we think its name in the John Day site is it Ecomotiolocula? It's a name, it's a long genus. But that animal is an oomyid. That the working hypothesis is it's like a secondary Asian immigrant. So primates go extinct at the end of the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, and then there's like this little pulse of Asian things that seem to come in to like this like messed up North American landscape. So we think that that is the last primate in North America. There's like this gap between.
So lineage died out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then persisted in Asia, and then it came over with squirrels. That's kind of when squirrels enter the North American picture. And then for whatever reason, like that doesn't diversify in North America. But yeah, that's the last holdout of primates in North America.
Thank you.
When the lemurs fell into the big hole, you know, where the tree roots were, you said most of them drowned. Are they not able to swim over to those roots and climb back?
Yeah, it seems like they freak out is like kind of the, like they don't swim often. And so like all mammals can swim, but they're not happy about it. And so it seems to kind of like lose focus in a way that they like fell.
Yeah.
And then yeah, they could obviously like get themselves out, but it seems like there's kind of a like drowning and panic. Which is something I actually don't know if the Lemur Center did any experiments with swimming lemurs.
Because whereas a monkey could probably swim over and climb back up.
Yeah, and it's one of those like these are like dry, like it's been dry. That's one of the important things about this site is it's dry today, and it was actually drier in the past. One hypothesis for like why there's all this diversity preserved in these caves, why there's Megalopus and elephant birds, was because this part of the world or that part of Madagascar was more lush in the past, and it's become dry over the course of the last couple of centuries of climate change. And that seems to not be the case. It was actually possibly drier in like when these fossils were being like mostly accumulating in the cave. Which is what's really interesting about this site is like I'm working right now on a paper describing a carnivore that's not a fossil. It's a whole like group of Malagasy carnivores that is only found in the eastern rainforest of Madagascar. And then we have this jaw like in the driest part of the driest like corner of Madagascar from like 1,000 years ago. And so that seems like evidence that the modern like range of this animal is not because it likes living in lush rainforest environments. It's clearly much more adaptable, but it's been like pushed out of the Southwest. Probably like what you see is when it becomes less dry in the Southwest is when we get the first evidence of people in the Southwest. It's like dry and inhospitable, there's no evidence of humans. And then it starts to become, it's never lush, but it becomes less forbidding. And then you start to get the first artifacts into the record. And we never see this carnivore again. We never see that there's this. So it seems like humans and probably dogs and cats and rats and the stuff that comes with humans have kind of like edged out a lot of this diversity. There's already diversity on the edge, like deserts are never like as reliable ecosystems as oceans.
With any Natalie Smith, please go to the information desk in our nature research center. Get Christy Natalie Smith. Please go to the information desk in our nature research center.
So that's to say the lemurs can have a lot of practice in water. Because it's like the water is going to be in these sinkholes. They're not crossing rivers. Because like there's platyrians in South America can swim, like howler monkeys will swim across water. But they live in kind of a lush setting in a way these animals wouldn't have experienced that much water before, just like sticking their heads in and like lapping it up. So I think that's the working idea for why they all unfortunately died.
Is there like, so when you're talking about like all the other extinct lemurs in Madagascar, is there like any specific reason that like the lemurs that are still alive today were able to survive and the other ones weren't?
That's a really important question. And the working idea is basically small-bodied animals have smaller ranges, and like more of them can live in a smaller area. And so it's easier to make a big animal go extinct because if you basically slice and dice its range by basically like a generation of farmers with a series of lifespans kind of carving into the forest will over time kind of block off this population of Madagascar of like Megalopithecus from this population of Megalopithecus that was all one breeding thing. And so then you get genetic isolation more rapidly for large bodied animals. Whereas smaller things can have, there's more of them can live in smaller areas, so they're less vulnerable to that kind of like genetic isolation. That said, all of the largest lemurs alive today, the Shafak, the blue-eyed black lemurs, are among the most endangered because they are also among the largest that are still alive. Injury are the biggest lemurs today, and there's maybe a couple hundred of them that are still in the wild. The greater bamboo lemur, there's like maybe a couple dozen of them left in the wild. They're like not huge animals, but it seems like we're kind of like marching through the body size, and so the threat continues. So we may have a world where it's just mouse lemurs, like the ones that they tend to do really well. They're nocturnal, they're small, they eat bugs, and so they seem to be among the less threatened lemurs that we have. But any lemur that you can see with your eyes during the day is like really.
It seemed to me that at one point you were doing studies that maybe you're paleobotanist studying the seeds, fossil seeds, and hoping to be able to maybe genetically modify plants today to be something that would help the lemurs, today's lemurs.
Yeah, there's kind of a couple different angles that people are looking at. One is introducing rice cultivation practices, horticultural practices that are require less water and less nutrients from the forest, essentially. And so one of the things that's amazing about the Lemur Center is we have a living colony of animals like at the Lemur Center. And this fossil collection is basically like a zoo and a museum. And we also have a conservation group based in Madagascar, in the Sava region, which is like in the northeastern corner. It's basically like the northern part of the rainforest. So it's like a biodiversity hotspot in Madagascar. And there, they work with local communities as a community-led, basically agricultural workshop is a lot of the work that they do, is how do you balance like getting enough calories out of the ground for your family, so all subsistence agriculture, with like while using the fewest number of resources to do that. Because arguably like rice is the wrong product for Madagascar, not wrong, but like it's culturally important, but it's not if you could kind of like go back and like pick what should we grow on in this type of soil. Rice is a really, really meaty crop. And so, but there are ways that it can be treated. There's varieties that have been introduced that are more dry resistant and are basically like produce reliable yields for people. But all farmers like are conservative in the sense of like there's worked for like the previous harvest. If it worked, then you don't want to mess with that too much. And so introducing new practices becomes a hard thing to do in North America, let alone in Madagascar, where there's much more at stake because it is like subsistence farmers, like what you make is for your family, not like Monsanto kind of like helping us all get our calories. Helping. There is a lot of what I think of as like hard won like knowledge through bad experimentation coming from like places like North America trying to help cultivation in Madagascar. But it's also hard because like what's at stake is so extreme for the people who work with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I should know better than to ask a zoologist why something happens, but why do the New World monkeys have prehensile tails and the Old World monkeys do not?
Yeah.
I know it's a little remote from the primates. When and where did the New World monkeys rise?
Yeah. So they got cut out of the talk because they was already getting on. So there's a whole different project that I'm involved in Peru. And there's a researcher who's based at Duke, who's now at the University of North Texas. And we're on the quest for basically like the earliest New World monkeys. Like they arrive in Africa about like during the Eocene, they're probably around like 40 million years ago. And what's kind of amazing about them is they had to cross the Atlantic Ocean, not just this Mozambique channel, so it's a much greater distance that monkeys had to cross. And there's this idea that lemurs were able to make the cross from Africa to Madagascar because some lemurs are able to go into torpor. Basically, like it's like super hibernation, and so that's how you can get across the ocean. But there's no evidence of any monkey ever being able to do torpor, and they were able to cross the entire Atlantic Ocean without that superhero trick. And it might have been useful for lemurs, but what flatirons, the New World monkeys, were able to do is this really amazing feat of distribution. Rodents also did that. And so we have, I didn't bring one, basically in the same sites where we find the Gigapithecus, we find animals that look exactly like the earliest primates we find in South America. So it's clear that there's like Africa to South America happens. And so then from there, there's this kind of stasis. There's lots of early experiments in being a primate in South America. And then suddenly there's like this explosion in diversity where like howler monkeys and spider monkeys, capuchins and marmosets all kind of diversified during the Miocene. And it's unclear like what triggers that to happen, like why there's this like repression of diversity for primates for a long time. They were there, but like a really non-factor, and then suddenly they diversified. And in that we get the prehensile tails. And there's a lot of hypotheses for, it's just in one group, it's just the Italians, and it co-evolves in two groups, the Italians, the spider monkeys, and the howler monkeys, and capuchins, which are like the organ grinder pirate monkeys. And the spider monkeys are the ones that are like true prehensile, like they're wrapping, it's like a limb that they're able to use. And interestingly, they are also very ape-like. Like they're the only monkeys that are able to, they have their shoulder blades in the back of their rib cage. Like most monkeys are quadrupeds, and a little bit like your dog, where if you have a dog, you can't, like your dog can't throw a baseball because it can't like rotate its arm like this. And neither can like a capuchin monkey, like or a vervet monkey or a bamboo. They're all kind of like this. So it's all kind of like University of Florida chop kind of thing. But spider monkeys have like rotated their shoulder blade back so they can reach above their heads. And so like the line that we always say in like teaching primate evolution is we need to rename monkey bars ape bars because only apes can do this. So like a monkey can't do monkey bars, except spider monkeys. And so one hypothesis, like spider monkeys have like figured out this way to like just put their wings wherever they want them, and then their tail just became like another thing they had. Whereas in the ape line, we lost our tail when we like got really good at kind of like squatting in trees. Like tails are a real liability, especially the primates because we bite them. Like this happens at the Lemur Center where there's like tons of infections that happen when like as signs of dominance and scuffling over who gets food, they bite each other's tails. And there's not a lot of meat on a tail. There's not a lot of vessels, and so there's not as much like white blood cell transmission that can get to sites of infection if a tail gets bitten. And so mammals tend to lose their tails if they don't really need them. And so in the ape line, we like lost our tails pretty early on. For some reason, they persisted in the fodder lines long enough. And so I've always been curious, like if you could rewind the clock, and if apes had lost their tails, would apes that had like prehensile tails because of this like climbing on like slow, deliberate climbing through complicated environments by putting your hands and feet everywhere? And we'll never know. But that seems to be part of the idea for prehensile tails.
Watch out for the Jeffrey spotted monkey called Guatemala, because they throw feces and rotten fruit at you.
Yeah,
The shorter anatomy you describe.
All right, well, thank you so much. That was a lot of fun.